Okay, I'm really going to get started now, so if you could sit down and thank you. So this morning we heard from our foundation, the folks who have been part of this community from the very beginning. And as we continue to build on this foundation, oh my goodness, guys, really, I'm talking. Thank you. I'm sorry. I know it's so hard because we haven't seen each other for a long time, and we are networking and we're meeting new people, and it's super hard. And we have so much cool stuff to share with you too. So I'm gonna have to try to find that balance of like, how do I capture the attention and not be like too rude? I don't want to be rude or anything. So forgive me if I cross the line, but thank you. So this morning, we heard about our foundation. We talked about a few questions, and I hope that it inspired questions in you too. And now we want to build on that. It's important that we build this sort of relatedness, that we connect. And honestly, all the conversation that we were just having that I interrupted is doing that. But there's a difference between just talking and really being present and having conversations that create space for possibility and for growth. And the FEMA Higher Education Program has invited each of you to be here, to join in this conversation so that we can build and sustain an emergency management profession through education. That's the Higher Education Program's mission, is to, again, build the emergency management profession through education. And this is a broad invitation. That is a broad mission. And there are many possibilities within that phrase of building the emergency management profession through education. And not all of those possibilities that we think of will be in alignment. Some of them might even be contrary to each other or appear that way. Not all of us bring the same gifts to the conversation. Absolutely, we don't bring the same perspectives. We bring the perspectives of our experience, of our background, of our heritage, and we're all different. And so how do we create that space so that we can create and really hear each other and come up with possibilities that bring out the best of the gifts that we have and create a significant impact? So this doesn't just come easy. I mean, we're really good at dialogue, and we're really good like, hey, what have you been up to? How's your vacation? How's your kids? We're really good at those sort of things. But then someone says, I don't think emergency management is really an academic discipline. I don't think it's important. And then how do we react? Do you feel the inner defensiveness? Do we create space? How do we have those conversations? This takes practice. You know, how do we invite people who feel that way to have a dialogue with us? So I've been really inspired by an author and I think just an incredible human being on the planet, Peter Block. How many of you have heard of him or read any of his books on community and building belonging? I've been inspired by him, and early in my career in the late 90s, I got to go to a very intimate workshop with him and Meg Wheatley, and it made a profound impact on my career of how I listen to people and how I try to create space for people. So I reached out to Peter Block and I said, hey, can you come? Because this community is just perfect for your message, and I'd love for us to have a conversation with you. And like Dave was saying, you know, a lot of people in our community that have inspired us are getting older, and he's getting older too. He's 78, and he's like, oh, I want to. I'm excited about the work that is happening in FEMA and in emergency management education, and that you're interested in whole community and having these conversations. But I can't make it. But I'm going to send to you someone I think that will carry my message and will carry what I would share with you. And he introduced me to Mr. LeeRush. And Lee is here with us today, and so I want to read his introduction, and he's going to guide us in an experience today so that we can practice how to have these conversations. So Lee is the executive director and founder of a organization called justCommunity. He comes from an education and health services background, and he's passionate about the power of communities in all different shapes and sizes. And Mr. Peter Block, as I mentioned, recommended him for our symposium. He studied with Mr. Block and has honed his expertise working with a lot of different communities to have these sort of conversations. He's with us today to share his experience and provide us with an opportunity to dialogue, to build those skills, to bring them into our rooms, into our classrooms, to help us to build a space and create more resilience within ourselves as a skill and with all those that reach us. He is a graduate of the Indiana University of Pennsylvania with a BA in Criminology, and he has a Masters of Education from Temple University. And I don't want to take any more time because I really want him to use this time to be with us. So without further ado, Mr. LeeRush.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you very much. Good morning. Okay. So, as Wendy said, this is an interesting talk for me, given that Peter gave her my name. He's one of my most honored teachers and mentors. So imagine one of your most inspired teachers that you have. You looked up to him for many years, you read their material, and suddenly you get a call one day and say, this person wants you to speak for him. So you can imagine my joy and also a little anxiety about that, given that Peter, I've been with him so often. If he was here, I'm sure he'd say some of the similar things. So first thing I want to do is acknowledge this person who's been our host this morning, and in a way I think that she embodies what this work is about, gracious spirit and gracious community and invitation. So Wendy Walsh, let's give her a hand for what she's done. Really. Just like many of you, I've been to many conferences and symposiums, and I know all the work that goes on behind the scenes with all the people that are, now acknowledging that their work is going to be enjoyed by all of you. So thank you again, Wendy, for inviting me and for putting this amazing symposium together. And thank you very much for this graphic artist. I think this is a wonderful way to also share the message. I do believe that pictures are worth 1,000 words. So maybe what I should do is just have a few pictures, and it kind of could carry my message. I also want to mention one other thing. This is a new audience for me. I'm an educator by trade. If somebody would ask me years ago what I do, I would say I'm a social studies teacher. Well, no, I usually would say just I'm a teacher. And then they would say, what? What do you teach, right? I usually would say social studies. So I don't teach that any longer. I used to work in a small alternative high school back in the 1970s, before alternative ed was a real thing in education. But we were trying to keep a lot of young people close to their homes when they got in trouble with the law. So kids who came through juvenile court were sometimes either encouraged to take a GED or go into the military, unfortunately, or drop out and get a job. But we didn't usually spend enough time in alternative education. So I love history, I love social studies, and now in a way, come full circle, I'm 63 years old, so 42 years after I started my career. In a way, I believe that I'm still teaching social studies, because I think being social and being with each other and studying it is really what this work is about. So given that it's a new audience for me, I thought, okay, wow, these are a lot of academics and a lot of professors and a lot of people in emergency management that I never took an official course in. So what could I possibly tell them? And then I realized, wait a minute, these are people just like myself, parents, uncles, nephews, brothers, and of course, aunts, uncles, aunts, nieces, sisters. But there's also a group in this room that I really want to take a minute and thank before I launch into my talk. Because while I've never been a victim of a mass disaster or kind of touched that kind of experience in my own personal life, there were two instances that happened that I probably came in touch with some of you. I want to take a minute and thank you. Many, many years ago, almost 35 now, my baby brother was killed in a car crash. And it was obviously a tragic moment for our family. I didn't really experience much death at that point. But the first connection I ever had with someone from that group of people that are here, I'm sure, in this room, a police officer who informed me my parents were away, they were traveling, and I was the oldest son. So I felt this sense of responsibility and what I was going to do, how I was going to tell my parents this news. But the police officer that held me, literally held me, and just said it's okay to cry, and he cried with me, has got quite a gift in him. So I don't know his name, but I know that some of you are law enforcement or doing that kind of work, and I want to recognize you. The other incident that happened years ago was a fire that occurred in my home. My wife was home. I was away visiting a friend. And I remember being at my friend's house, and I would live in a small town near Philadelphia. I remember hearing the fire whistle and thinking, oh my God, somebody has a fire. And then I got in a car and drove home, and little did I know it was my house who had caught fire. And, you know, if you've ever experienced this, you know the physical sensation. Your heart is just bursting out of your chest, fear. And when I ascertained my wife was fine, the first fireman that came over to me, and again, this fireman knew probably more than anything they might learn in a classroom. He just knew how to treat me because he knew what I was probably experiencing as a traumatic event. And he too held me when he saw me cry and the fear that I had. And here's something I never forgot. We had 2 cats, so I couldn't find one. And then I figured, okay, well, one must have run away. And then I turn around behind me, there's an ambulance, and the fireman brings out our cat, and there's a little oxygen mask in front of this cat, right? I did not like cats until this moment. So I want to thank you. If there's any firemen or firewomen or police officers or policewomen or policemen, would you please stand, or first responders or people that are in those audiences, stand up, please. Thank you. So I wanted to get a chance to thank you, those of you that stood, because I know you represent so many millions of people in America that are volunteering your time to be with citizens when those kinds of things happen. And we still have cats, so I can thank you for my cats' lives in our life today. Okay, so what I'd like to do today, I already mentioned I come from Pennsylvania, live up near Bucks County, or in Bucks County, near Philly, about 30 miles north of the city. I'm a unique American in some ways, that my ancestors, my kin that came from Europe, actually settled in this same community. So when Wendy talks a little about building community, in a way, my bloodline has been in that community since 1690. So I haven't moved too far. I mean, no, it's pretty rare. A lot of people move around a lot. But this is where they settled, from Western Europe, Germany, Switzerland. I think there's somebody here from Switzerland. It's amazing to understand the distance that some of you have traveled to be here. And I only had to drive about 3 hours to get down here. And it's a real treat to represent Peter today. So I think I only saw one person's hand up when they said I had heard of Peter Block. So this is Peter, taken a little bit longer ago than he's now 78. He's probably taken in his 60s. He's been at this his whole life. He's formerly engineer, trained at Yale, author of many books. And when I first heard of him about 10 years ago, he had written a book called Community, The Structure of Belonging. I know Wendy has a copy here. I brought my copy that I carry around almost every trip I take because it's become, in a way, my Bible. When I saw the title, Community, The Structure of Belonging, being that my company was called justCommunity, that I founded about 20 years ago, and that much of my work is now working with community, what we call community coalitions. Much of my work is involved with youth development. So my background was, as I mentioned, working with juveniles. So we started working with communities that are working together, all these sectors: police, faith communities, parents, youth organizations, schools, students themselves. I very rarely would talk to many audiences around youth development without youth in the audience. We can't do youth development without young people in the audience. And this book, my goal today is to really introduce you to the book, because I know there's many educators in here, many professors, many teachers, and many students. So each of you can probably benefit a great deal, I think, from some of the methodologies that are introduced into this work. And now when I work with large groups, I'm always doing what we're going to do a little bit today. So I have about 20 minutes to get you some context about some of the material in this book, and then we're going to spend actually 20 minutes in doing what you were doing before we started this section, which was talking to each other, which is the benefit of being together in a large group like this, to have some time to have smaller conversations. So, you probably can't read that in the very back. I'll read it for you. I'm going to give you a couple of quotes from Peter. One of the ones I like the most is, I usually say to groups, and raise your hands seriously, how many of you are in this room to change the world? All right, that's what I figure. Almost all of you. So the answer is, how do you change the world? And the answer is what? Can anybody read it from the front row? One room at a time is the answer. How do you change the world? One room at a time. This is all I've got. This is all you've got. It's all we've got, at least for the next 8 minutes. So I share that purposely because I remember when I was in about 7th grade, one of my science teachers said to us, all we've got is about 8 minutes that we're sure of. And I thought, what is this? And immediately I paid attention because I thought, what a strange thing to say. So does anybody know why we only have 8 minutes to know for sure what we have? I know some people know this. It takes 8 minutes from the light that have left the sun to hit our faces right now. So I remembered that always, that man, that person really put something in perspective for me, that light travels at 186,000 miles per second, sun's 93 million miles away. It got me thinking. So that kind of teacher I paid attention to. When Peter said this the first time I was in a room, he said, all we've got is one room right now. And technically this room is not constructed for community building, is it? A community building construction would be completely open space, no fixed seatings, no fixed seats, and chairs that are usually are movable, have wheels on them. So we're going to move around a little bit, so we'll have to make do today. But the room that we're in is all we've got. So how do you change the room that you're in? We're going to move around a little bit. We're going to get you up and we're going to go and meet 2 new people that you haven't really probably met yet probably before today. And we're going to suggest a conversation. Now, of course, given the time constraints that I have, we're not going to get through all the conversations. But in his book, Peter talks about 6 essential conversations, what he calls conversations that matter. And whenever I bring together people in my community where I live and when I travel, we practice some of these types of conversations. And I'll share with you in just a few minutes what they're called, what they're actually named. Another quote of Peter, every hour needs to be an example of our intention, otherwise the hour is lost forever. So when I was given 45 minutes for this talk today, a little bit of a shorter hour, but my intention is to introduce you to this concept called a small group methodology that's very easily transferable to your own situations, and then to intend to have people practice it, as Wendy said, that we're actually going to hear a little bit what it is, and then do a little bit. So it's a real example of an experiential learning hour. Now this quote here, some of you are old enough. Anybody born between 46 and 64? Baby boomers? A lot of you in here. All right, so especially that generation probably remembers EST. Remember EST, Werner Erhard, back in the 70s, and pretty well known for a large group methodology of changing people's ways that they think and how they perceive their world. This is one of Werner's quotes. All transformation is based in linguistics. I love this quote. All change is based in linguistics, or all of our transformation, all of our transformative thoughts. First comes thought. The human animal is a thought-making creature. We create stories. You know, we have the intelligence to have thought and awareness and self-identity, and then we speak in language to other people, and the way that we construct our language a lot of times is how we construct our reality. In other words, how we tell our story to the people that we meet tells a lot about how we are viewing the world. So do you ever hear the statement that the past is the past and you can't change the past? Anybody ever hear that? You can't change the past, you can change the future, or I'm sorry, the present, you know what you're doing? Well, in this worldview, the past is changeable. And the way that the past is changeable is how? You tell a different story about what happened to you. So those of you who are familiar with trauma-informed education now, we know now in schools that we're not so interested anymore asking people what's wrong with them, but really what happened to them, or what happened in their life, or what happened around them. So the way that we tell our story, you know, some people who grew up in a family of tremendous heartache, maybe if there was alcoholism or drug addiction or whatnot, you know, I can remember hearing years and years ago, people would talk about some of my former students. One of my students once said, "My dad's no good. He left our family. My mom said he's a deadbeat." And I said, well, that is language that your mother shared with you, but there's another probably story that's probably in there if we do some work together. And that might just be that my father, he was learning to say over his time with us, that my father had a disease. So decades ago, people didn't usually view drug addiction and alcoholism as a physical, as a chemically involved disease of the way our brains are working and the way our bodies are reacting to certain substances. So the way that we tell our story could be that, you know, the negative connotation, or that I came up in a family and my father was really ill, and he was filled with such shame that he couldn't face just dealing with his family, and he ran away. And I'm a survivor, and I lived through that, and I'm stronger for it. So the way that people tell stories is it tells a lot about how they view their past. Okay, so getting ready for us to do our small experiential work here, these are a couple of values or a couple of concepts that I think are really important to kind of put out first. And by the way, raise your hand if you were in that pre-conference yesterday about mindfulness. I know I saw some familiar faces. I was in there with you. It was a lovely exercise. Leah Weiss is the professor from Stanford who gave that workshop. I'm always, you know, this will be one of my memories from this event besides the event, was being in that workshop because I learned another beautifully little designed exercise. She put us in threes, a little triad, which we're going to be into in just a few minutes. She put us in triads, and she said each person has about 6 minutes to talk to your partners. And the first 2 minutes are the first third of your life. The second 2 minutes are the second third of your life. And the third part will be the last third of your life. So I was 63, so I just, you know, divided everything by 3. So I talked for 2 minutes about my from 0 to 21, from 20 to 40. You get the point. And then what happened is she said, I want the people who listen to the speaker just to feed back to the speaker the values or the kind of undergirding principles you heard in the person's life. Just give them some words. It was a beautifully designed exercise because then we could jot down some words that other people heard as we told some of our story. So the idea about connecting before you give content, that workshop to me was an example of just using some intellectual material and then kind of breaking people into small groups. I expect to do a little bit of the same thing here today because in a way you're kind of launching into the symposium after today. My hope is that you meet some people in this very next half hour that you're going to see maybe in another workshop at lunch, and you're going to seek them out maybe to have more conversation with them, or just the example of going up and meeting new people and really purposefully making this an opportunity to make some new connections and new friends even. So the idea of connecting before content, we tell teachers that all the time. You know, spend the first couple days with your class and don't break out the textbook. Don't break out your syllabus. Just have some fun with them. I always believe that if kids are not having fun in school, teachers aren't having fun either. And I mean, you know, the good kind of fun. To have kind of interaction with them that are playful and experience each other as people first before they're students. All right, I'm going to kind of do the opposite of this one today because depth over speed, given the time constraint that I'm in, doesn't allow me sometimes the amount of time that it would take to really fully develop some of these conversations. But I love the idea of going deeper before you go faster. When I go to schools today, most of my work is traveling in American schools, working in something called restorative justice, restorative discipline, restorative practices, which is old as the hills, basically. It's about how to relate to people as human beings first, maybe do circles with them, and if there's harm that occurs between people, how to resolve some of that harm, how to have face-to-face conversations to make amends. But too often teachers say, well, I don't have enough time. I don't have enough time. And I say, well, I'm sorry, but there is no more time. And everybody knows this, there's no more time any of us is getting. So the real trick is, how do you manage time? How do you make time for some of these things? And the pressure they face a lot of times are outside pressures, like standardized testing, other people's goals. But those teachers that really can find the way to do this stuff first, their payoff is, at the end of the day, they get a lot more interaction and engagement with students. And too often, if they don't value this depth over speed, they're just blowing through their curriculum so they can check the box a lot of times, because that's a lot of times what they're asked to do is, can you be held accountable to handle all your material, and are your kids ready to take the standardized test? So that battle continues, the pressures between other people's agenda and what really good teachers know has to happen first, that connection and slowing down a little bit. Effectiveness over efficiency. This is one of the things that is talked about in this book, and here's a little chart that I picked up regarding, so I used to be the human resources director for a healthcare company, about 600 employees, and in the business world, they would understand this very easily, and I'm sure many of you probably have seen this before. But the difference between effectiveness on that axis and efficiency on that axis is doing things right versus doing the right things. The goal, of course, is to do the right things the right way. I'm going to go back to education. I said earlier, a lot of people sometimes fall in that check-the-box mentality. Let me take assistant principals for an example. They're dealing with a lot of behavior. Usually they're the ones handling the disciplinary actions. And too often kids are suspended when they don't really need to be suspended. Maybe they need to be dealt with in a different way. Because suspension, we tell teachers all the time, is basically teaching people how to do time. Anybody can do time. You can do time, I can do time. That's when my daughter, when she got in trouble sometimes, I said, no, you're not grounded necessarily. She would die when I tell her she has to write another essay. But she really sometimes wrote essays about her awareness about what her behavior was and how it was affecting people. So here's what happens a lot of times, is people are very efficient because they do a lot of things the right way. They have their butt covered. They handle paperwork well. They're documenting everything they do. And they did it the right way because that's how the bureaucracy taught them to do things. But sometimes when you ask assistant principals, I'll use that example again, what is the right thing to do? A lot of times it is that conversation, and make that happen with the people that are really able to influence a student, like their grandparents, maybe their aunts, their uncles, their neighbors, their coaches, their mentors, to get those people in a circle and talk with them about how their behavior has affected each other. But that does take some time. So what a lot of schools are working on is how to reconfigure some of their structure and their schedule to build time in for these circles or for these conversations. And those that do, the research is starting to bear out a lot of positive results, less suspensions, more student engagement, higher attendance, better academic achievement, and in a way, more connection with the teachers too. We're losing teachers. You know this probably. Half of American teachers that come into our field of education, within 5 years, half of them are gone. They're leaving our field in droves. And I don't think it's because of money and benefits. I think it's more about how they're handled sometimes with their structure of their classrooms and what they're expected to do within the time they have. Okay, so I want to move us into these small groups. So these are the 6 conversations that Peter talks about in his book. And you have a handout. Hopefully you got the handout and walked in. If you don't have it, it'll be on the back table. Almost all these questions that you're not going to all have a chance to do today, but you'll see them. They're in another little packet. I call it the Cliff Notes of Peter's book. But these are the conversations. So somehow you all were invited here. You took the invitation up. Sometimes you're encouraged to come to events like this. But you've all been here through some invitation. And as I said earlier, not only is it a beautiful place to be for a few days, the campus is gorgeous. The hospitality is very evident, as you saw earlier, as I mentioned, what I think Wendy and her staff have done in terms of welcoming people. But the next conversation is when you're together, I'm not interested much in solving problems anymore, as antithetical as that sounds. I'm very interested in discussing possibilities that exist. There is a place for problem solving. Don't get me wrong, of course. That's obviously what we do when there's problems. We try to work on solutions. But the idea of possibility looks like this. There's a couple of questions that can launch us into this conversation. So everybody stand up. I'd like you to do this rather quickly because we don't have a lot of time. Now, while you're standing, how many of you came with other people? Raise your hand if you're already sitting with people you know. All right, here's a couple of ground rules. I'll be a teacher for a minute. You cannot talk with anybody you came with. All right? So the idea here is that you're going to find two other people, and the reason being that the idea behind finding people who you're not as well acquainted with is that you're going to have a different conversation. If you sit with people who you work with or you came with, I guarantee you, you're going to have more of a predictable conversation. And once you hear the prompt that I'm going to give you, you'll notice that how the conversation is going to be different with people you don't know as well as another. Another reason that you're going to find two people is sometimes if it's just, well, a three-person group is the smallest circle, we say. And three people in a triad is a lot less stable. So it's an unstable organism you're with. Here's why. If it's just a pair of people, if it's just a dyad, one of you might be an extrovert, strong, and one of you might be an introvert, and you'll be perfectly satisfied for 10 minutes sitting there. One of you could listen forever, and one of you could talk forever, and you'll be, oh, that was the best thing I've been in. So we want to make it a little bit less comfortable, because in a way, powerful questions are a little bit of an anxiety-provoking thing. You're not sure how this is going to go. You're going to take maybe a little risk, and the risk might be different with people who you work with, or I'm sorry, that you do not work with. The other reason that you're with three people is it's going to double your chance that you're going to like one of them. All right? So we want to increase the probability that you're going to have a positive experience here, because you never know, you might end up with somebody that reminds you of your former husband or wife or girlfriend, boyfriend. Oh my God, I can't sit and talk to this person. All right, so here's how this works. Turn around, not all of you. Okay? Now, what I'd like you to do, because we don't have enough room to move, of course, big time, so maybe just move a couple chairs. I want you to find, hold on before you move, you're going to find two people and immediately kind of just cluster together and maybe sit maybe in a new row, or you can even stand if you'd like. It's going to be about a 10-minute exercise. So when I raise my hand, let's just practice this part because I don't want to yell over everybody. So when I raise my hand, you all raise a hand. Go ahead. All right, beautiful. Everybody's listening so well. All right, so you'll find those two people, and then when I raise a hand, you raise a hand, I'll give you the prompt, okay? Find two people who you don't work with or don't travel with.
I got to hang out with Peter for a week in Angeles area, out Mount Madonna in California.
Oh, I know his talk out there. You're lucky. You were in that school? Okay. All right, see a hand, raise a hand. Thank you. Okay. So now, you might want to sit down, okay? Some of you are going to sit because we're going to take a little bit of time for this. So sit down with your three-person group. Okay. So here's the prompt. So here's a couple of other guidelines. When you're in this conversation, as I mentioned yesterday, that well-designed conversation was given to us by Professor Weiss, and she said, listen differently. In other words, she gave us a very structured way to listen. She said, listen for the person's story that they're telling you, a third in their life early on, a mid-third, and a last third. She goes, but listen for the values that you feel that you're being, that kind of is being shared, the embodiment of the values the person is telling you. So this type of listening here, similar, but instead of listening for values, I just want you to listen for curiosity's sake. So sometimes when people listen, they're listening because they're not speaking, but their minds are not listening. You ever been in those situations yourself that you're listening to somebody, but your mind's already making up your response? Like they might say something, oh, why am I say that? but and then your mind's going off for just a second or two, and you miss 2 or 3 words. So in this type of listening, I want you, if there's time left over, because each of you are going to have about 2 minutes, and if you have a little bit of time, instead of going off on a tangent, turn to one of your mates and go, tell me a little bit more about what you just said. In other words, we want you to be curious about people in this few-minute exercise. Or you can just thank people. You can just say, thank you very much. So those are the 2 responses that we'd like you to practice. Just thank somebody for what they said. If you want to just sit in silence for a minute or 2, I challenge you to try that, to just sit there and look at each other and just regard each other as an interesting person. Or say, tell me a little bit more. So this possibility conversation is what we're going to do for just a few minutes. And possibility is it's an invitation for the future to come into the present. That's what I love about this conversation. Because the future never gets here, does it? We never experience the future, do we? No, we never experience the future, because every minute we're alive is the present. So the idea behind this question, and here's the prompt for you. Not necessarily what crossroads. We heard a great beginning. Thank you for that. For me personally, it was interesting to me about the history that you have, the field that you're in, the foundation that you're all planted in. But I'm not interested in you talking about the crossroads that FEMA is at or the Department of Homeland Security. The prompt is, what crossroads do you find yourself at this point in your life? I know, it's a little deep, a little early in the morning. But I don't have much time, so let's get at it. What crossroads do you find yourself at this point in your journey, in your life? You know, if it was me in there, I'd talk about empty nest. My daughter moved out. My wife and I are going to sell our house maybe and move who knows where. But what crossroads are you at? And be mindful about not jumping in and telling anybody what you did if you were at that crossroads. Okay? Just say thank you or tell me a little bit more. So you have a total of about 9 minutes, or about 8 minutes, about 2 minutes each. And I'll raise my hand, and then we'll do what's called like a large group reconnection. And I'll have a couple people with microphones. So what crossroads are you at this point in your life? Whatever level you're risking to share. Ready? Go.
So we have like 15 minutes left.
15 left. Yep.
That's how I'm a social studies teacher as well.
Oh, nice to meet you.
My hands are chalky. Now yours are too.
I'm mindful of my microphone being on.
Oh, okay.
I don't know how to turn it off, so I don't want to talk. Everybody will hear me. But I'd love to talk to you afterwards, yeah. So you were in that circle with Peter?
Yeah.
Did you work there? Did you teach there?
I just came to hear him and the Angeles Arians.
Nice.
I love him very much.
Yeah.
She's guided me as well. So I love Peter's ideas. Thank you for doing this work.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Restorative justice and preventing bullying.
Do you have a card? I'll get it. Okay. Do those handheld?
Yeah, they've got them.
Do you know where they are? Excuse me. Sorry to interrupt. Do you know who has the handheld mics? Some of your staff?
Yeah,
I'll find
Jonathan.
them. He gave them to somebody. I'll find them. I'll find them. Do you know who has the other mic? Okay. So when I get some people up, you're going to run around and give them? Okay. All right, good. Okay, take a couple more minutes. Take 2 more minutes. Okay. So when you see a hand, raise a hand. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. All right, so we have a couple people with microphones. What I'd like to do next for just a minute or two is do, instead of what we call debriefing in the vernacular, you know, how many times have you been in workshops where you do small group work and somebody does a little piece of work and they record it and then there's a reporter and you report out? You have report outs? Oh, yeah. Yes? Well, for me, I get bored a lot of times in report outs. I start counting how many small groups there are. Here's a more unique, I think, interesting way to debrief or kind of check in on what happened just in that few minutes. So the question that I learned from Peter is basically what struck you in the conversation. And again, if you think that language is so important, vocabulary, the word struck is very instructive because it invites lightning into the room and invites some energy into this room. This room, as I said, is really constructed for someone to be up there and talking at you the whole time, which this is kind of antithetical to my message here, which is basically the real information, the community is right here. It's between and amongst ourselves. And this is what we try to do in this work to introduce this method in communities, get people talking again to each other. So the best way to kind of get the whole group reconnected, ask a couple people just to stand up one at a time and just answer the question of what struck you in the conversation that you had. And I know there's somebody itching right now to go. So just raise your hand. We'll find a microphone. Here you go. So just tell us your name. Tell us your name. Wait till you get the mic so we can hear you. Tell us your name, where you're from, and what struck you.
Valerie Lucas McEwen. I teach at CSU Long Beach, and what struck me was how much traveling that we all did and wanted to do and had already done. And that was part of the whole changes. So.
Right, and you get a lot from traveling, right? Yeah. Stories, culture, food, fun. Excellent. All right, somebody else. What struck you? Stand up, please.
Hi,
Tell
Dee
us
Dee
your name,
Bennett.
where you're from. Go ahead.
It's loud. Dee Dee Bennett, University of Nebraska at Omaha. One thing that, two things struck me. One, I found someone else named Dee Dee, so I was really excited by that.
There you go.
Two is that we all had some sort of crossroads that we were going through, and they were at different stages of life. And so it was really interesting to hear how, when a student was going through what I'm going through, and then someone older than me is going through, and at that, it was really interesting to see the stages of life in our crossroads, and it almost seemed like it probably something that we will all go through at some point. So it's pretty cool.
All right. I won't ask you if your group paid attention and didn't give anybody any advice or no help. Good. Because I actually forgot to tell you that was one of the rules. No advice giving. This is an advice-free zone. Because oftentimes when people talk about crossroads, somebody wants, oh, let me tell you what I did at that point in life. It assumes that it worked out okay, right? So it doesn't really help sometimes to hear what other people have done. Sometimes it does. But just being listened to is really the purpose of this conversation. So let's have one more. Somebody else? Oh, okay, go ahead.
I'm Sandy Smith from Arkansas Tech University. What struck me was what Peter's story from South Africa has said. We all sit beside our own pool of tears. And I would also add, we also sit beside our own pool of possibilities.
Thank you. Excellent. Beautiful. And that's a perfect segue into this final conversation, because that's all I have time for today. And that is that if you're going to do this, having people take a little risk with each other and just be a little vulnerable here in a short time, is not to forget, so we'll jump over some of these, but the book is just beautifully constructed about what the conversation prompts are for all these. Ownership, over blame. That question is, how do I contribute to the thing I complain about the most? Great quote in there is, complaining is an advertisement for helplessness. So that's a wonderful conversation that you can talk about later. Dissent over lip service. Dissent is like a good thing when it's invited and it's structured in a positive way. It's not rebellion. It's basically kind of looking at dissent as a positive strength-building activity in community. And this last one I want you to do real quick. It takes about a minute. There's a minute lightning round. Tell the person that you just talked with, the person that listened to you, one thing that you see in them immediately as a gift. Could be their smile. Could be their listening. Could be their relating of their story to yours. Or tell them a gift that you got from them or the gift that you see in them. And this is a purposeful conversation because too often people skip over this. And this is really, I loved what you said about, we have tears beside us too, but we have gifts all the time in amongst ourselves. So turn to the person to just listen to or talk with. Tell them one thing. Each of you go real quick, lightning round the gift. And don't give the gift I see in both of you. Don't go too quick. Make it individual and say their name. In other words, slow down. We're going to go deeper, not speed, but what gift did you see in them or got from them? And then we'll wrap up. Okay. So if you see a hand, raise a hand. Thank you. Okay, so I just have a couple of minutes to finish up here, and obviously that's speed dating in a way about community building. I get what I get for 45 minutes. That's the most challenging thing. But anyway, I'm glad that I got the opportunity to be here. I'm glad I got the opportunity to meet many new people, a new field for me to be in front of. I'm glad that you heard the name Peter and about the work that he's doing and about this book that's about ready to be published next week in its second edition. So it's a very well-read book in our field now in education. I think it's expanding into faith communities, anybody working with communities. So I wanted to mention real quick, if you're interested, what's really cool about Peter is he's made his money. He's got a bunch of books out there. One sold 2 million copies called Flawless Consulting. He doesn't travel as much. But he said about 15 years ago he decided to plant some roots and stop traveling around the world talking and be a community member, be a citizen. So he settled in Cincinnati. I said, why Cincinnati? He goes, that's where my wife lives. And he got married. And it's like, okay, that's important. Go live with your new wife. And he's in Cincinnati. And if you're interested, every couple months he holds a full-day intensive. And if you're interested to go to this website, asmallgroup.net, for $35, you can drive to Cincinnati or fly there, take a potluck piece of food, and sit around and do this methodology with Peter and many practitioners in and around, well, people now, might be because I've been sharing this all over the country, people show up from many cities to do this, to learn about this methodology. So you can go to asmallgroup.net. And there's a booklet in the back called Civic Engagement and the Restoration of Community. That's the booklet you can pick up at the back table. It pretty much has all these prompts in it. It's the Cliff Notes version of the book in a way, but enjoy the work. I want to have one last thing, I'll let you go. I said I was a social studies teacher, and I can't pass today without mentioning today, because I'm a big history buff, a baby boomer, and I remember very, very vividly where I was this morning 50 years ago, as many of you do too, if you're boomers or a little bit older. So I woke up one morning of June 5th, 68, as a 13-year-old boy, wondering what, I was going to face, because at that point the Vietnam War was really ramped up. A Tet Offensive had happened. I didn't know, and at 13, what do you know? It's like, do I smell today? Do I sit beside the right girl in class? I mean, But suddenly, my world really did fall apart, because I didn't see my mother cry a lot. Good German woman, father working and, stoic at times. And I woke up and she was crying. And she's a Republican. So that's an interesting thing, because she's kind of political. But what happened, of course, you know this. Robert Kennedy was shot on this date. Now, not many people remember that he was shot a day before he was pronounced dead. But I want to mention him just for a minute, because in a way, he's an example to me of what changing the conversation can do. And if you know your history, you remember April 4th, 1968. He landed in Indianapolis. He was on his way perhaps to be the next nominee of the Democratic Party. Who knows, perhaps our next president. But what happened is Martin Luther was murdered in Memphis. He was told by his handlers, do not go out into the community tonight. There's too much, whatever, unpredictability. And he said, no, I'm going. And he got up on a flatbed, little wagon, a little truck, and he gave one of the most amazing speeches, I think, in American history about coming together, about 5 or 7 minutes. If you've never heard it, Google it sometime and listen to what he said to the crowd that gathered in Indianapolis. He basically appealed to all of our humanity. He talked about his brother being murdered for the first time in public. And he basically told people that it doesn't have to be what could be happening in terms of the strife and the violence between black and white America that happened that night. Indianapolis was one of the only cities in America that did not burn that night. And there was many fires going on across the whole country this whole summer 50 years ago. So being, that I have that perspective, knowing how awful that year was, I leave that with a message that conversation and encouragement to remember that we're all the same on some level that can change the whole world for people. So Indianapolis is a prime example of what RFK did that night. And I just wanted to take a moment and mention his life and who he was and what he did, I think, for many people. So I wish you well in your conference. I thank Wendy very much for having me. Think about the language you use, the conversations you have, and have a great week, everybody. Thank you very much.